It's been nearly 13 months since Cuba and the United States re-established diplomatic relations after more than 50 years. But don't tell that to Fidel Castro. At the age of 90, he may look frail, but there's nothing wrong with the former Cuban president's willingness to take on an old foe. In an article published over the weekend, Castro criticized the United States for what he calls the dangers it's caused humanity, writing that mankind is faced today with the greatest danger in its history. We must preserve peace around the world and must not let any world power believe it has the right to kill millions of human beings. Later, we'll talk with a former Cuban diplomat and a Cuban journalist. But first, for more on Cuba's former president and icon, here's CCTV's Michael Voss.
As Cubans flock to the annual Summer Arts and Crafts Fair in Havana, they first pass through an entrance hall lined with photographs of former leader Fidel Castro, one of many tributes to mark his 90th birthday. Some stop to pose for pictures beside portraits of the man who ruled this island for almost half a century. His official title today is Historic Leader of the Revolution.
He's like my grandfather. Everyone loves him. He is important in this country and in the whole world.
Fidel Castro may be old and frail, and he's rarely seen in public. But politically, he is aware of what's going on in the world around him, and when he doesn't approve of something, he says so.
It was the historic visit of US President Barack Obama that prompted Fidel's most recent intervention, writing that it was enough to give Cubans a heart attack on hearing what he called Obama's sugar-coated words. Fidel Castro then made a rare appearance at the Communist Party Congress in April, speaking of his mortality, but confident that his politics would outlive him.
Everyone's turn must come, but the ideas of the Cuban communists will remain.
De los comunistas cubanos.
Some now suggest that in old age, Fidel Castro has become a rallying point for those who want to maintain communist orthodoxy and limit the pace of change.
Yo soy fidelista.
I'm a Fidelista, a supporter of Fidel Castro, 72-year-old Miriam Oliveira told me proudly. She agrees with Castro's skepticism over renewed relations with the United States.
Cuba tiene que tener cuidado.
Cuba must be careful. We welcome the reestablishment of relations, but we have to tread cautiously. They have always tried to use ideology against us. I'd prefer they didn't come to open businesses here.
Es un cuento camino.
In his speech to Congress, Raul Castro said, half-jokingly, that there are two political parties in Cuba, those who follow Fidel Castro and those who support Raul. But magazine editor and social commentator Rafael Hernandez believes that Fidel Castro's influence today is limited.
I think that it is very clear. They have two different roles. Raul was the co-pilot, he was the pilot. Now Raul is the pilot, and he is not the co-pilot, but he is walking around in the cabin. He didn't live 100% the airplane. But he is, from time to time, he's saying something.
Fidel Castro at 90. Whatever his influence, there are no signs that he intends to go quietly. Michael Voss, CCTV, Havana.
Joining us from Havana to talk about the influence and legacy of Fidel Castro, as well as Cuba's developing relationship with the United States, is Cuban journalist Cristina Escobar. With us here in Washington is Erick Langer. He's a professor of Latin America history at Georgetown University, and also with us from Havana is Cuban diplomat and educator Carlos Alzugaray. Thanks to all of you. Ambassador Alzugaray, let me start with you. So Fidel Castro turns 90, and he's showing that he still has a lot of fire in him. Very harsh criticism of the United States. Why is Fidel Castro being so critical of the United States at a time when both nations are trying to restore diplomatic and other relations and put the past behind them?
Well, I think you have to take into account how much hostility he received from the United States for many years. After all, he has a record of being the object of assassination attempts for many years. Plus, he, no doubt, that has an anti-hegemonic or counter-hegemonic position in world affairs, and he looks at the United States as not completely reforming, His attitude towards the Obama administration has been critical at times, but at times he has also praised the Obama administration. I think that if you take into account his history, if you take into account how much the U.S. tried to destroy him, I think it's normal that he would have a very critical attitude towards the United States. After all, he's not in power right now. If he would be the president, one wonders if he would have the same kind of reaction, but he's now a free man. He can say whatever he thinks, and obviously he's saying it.
Cristina, when we listen to some of the rhetoric coming from Fidel Castro, it sounds like some of the words we used to hear during the Cold War. And of course, the younger generation in Cuba will not have very strong memories of that war. So how do young people in Cuba see Fidel Castro now?
That's a very good question. You know, we still have a very strong policy that comes from the Cold War, which is the blockade or embargo, as you call it in the U.S., and that's still in place, even in this scenario in which Obama has asked several times to the Congress that leave that blockade. So when he talks about the future, we would love to see that future, but actually, in our present, we still have that very old policy. Fidel is a man that has an unquestionable leadership and authority in Cuba, even among young people as myself and in my generation. Of course, we do understand that he was the president and governed through a different time than the one that we're living right now. And Raul Castro is being developing in a very independent agenda and related to the moments that we're living in. But we still see Fidel as an ideological pattern to follow in some cases, and also a person that did a lot for Cuba, that developed a lot of things that we inherited today, and of course someone that is getting old and is taking his time to be with his family, and now we have a different president. That's very important to understand. He's not ruling in Cuba, he's not governing Cuba, and Raul is doing it now, and even though we see him with respect and a kind of thank him for what he's done, we do know that we need different things now, and we're looking forward to the future. But with the U.S., it's very, let's say, logic to see him saying that, because he has gone through very difficult periods in which dialogue or even a small understanding was not an option like it is now with President Barack Obama.
Eric, as the ambassador told us, Fidel Castro is no longer in power. He is a former president. But when we listen to what he says, especially about the United States, is that an indication that there is a significant element in Cuba that is resistant to change, or is it just Fidel Castro telling us we shouldn't forget about history?
Well, I think most of all it's Fidel Castro trying to preserve his legacy. And that clearly has to do with the Cold War. It has to do with, as my Cuban colleagues talked about, a legacy of assassination attempts, et cetera, And what I think actually is interesting is that Fidel maintains this kind of logic and continues to talk about it. But in fact, he's really created a whole new generation of Latin American leaders, some of whom are in fact in power right now, too. So in many ways, his legacy lives not just in Cuba, but in many other countries in Latin America as well. So in that sense, I think he's really just trying to, he can be the gadfly now. He doesn't have to be the practical politician.
Yeah, he doesn't have the responsibilities of actually being in power right now. Ambassador Alzugaray, is there, I mean, when we listen to the words coming from Fidel Castro and from his brother, Raul Castro, is there something of a disconnect between the brothers? On the one hand, we've got Raul Castro, who's leading these efforts to restore, to normalize relations with the United States.
Well, I think the way you should see it is, or at least the way I see it, is that they have coincided strategically all the time. And as a matter of fact, during years, Raul Castro was completely loyal to Fidel, even though at times he made it a point to say that he didn't think exactly like his brother. So I think there is this kind of relationship between them, older brother, younger brother relationship, in which there is mutual respect, there is mutual acceptance of each other's role, and now Fidel is accepting Raul's role, as he made it clear at his short speech at the Congress of the Cuban Communist Party. I would like to pick up on something that Eric said. I think Fidel Castro's legacy is not related only to having led Cuba through the difficult period of the Cold War, well, people like to call it, but this is a conflict between Cuba and the United States that he gave a solution. The solution was independence. And he really tried to make some deal with the United States, as well, it has been documented how many approaches he made to the United States, and he was usually rejected. So I think it's not the Cold War. I think his legacy is of what we might call the second Latin American and Caribbean independence, and that's why he's so much respected, not only in Cuba, but in all Latin America and the Caribbean, because he has led the way in showing two things: the independence of Latin America from the United States, and secondly, the empowering of the masses of people who have been exploited until the Cuban Revolution. I think these are two things that you have to tip the hat to him and say that he got that right.
Erick, is that something that's perhaps overlooked, the fact that Fidel Castro did make approaches to the United States, did reach out to try and normalize relations, but was rebuffed, was rejected?
Well, I think in part, but in fact, I think in some cases it worked, such as under the Carter administration, where clearly Cuba and the United States talked about the Marielito boat lift, what was happening there, the permission for people to leave, etc. So my sense is I'm not a diplomat. I've never been part of the Foreign Service or something like that. But it's quite clear that under the radar, there were always conversations going on at different kind of levels, despite the rhetoric. And this is something that I think perhaps now future historians can look at, once documents are declassified and things like that. But quite clearly, it was never in the best interests of both Cuba and the United States to completely stop relations, though that probably did happen, let's say, in the early 1960s. But after that, I think there were always ways of communicating, and that's something that we need to look at, I think, in the future. Because quite clearly there always was some kind of coordination despite the rhetoric. And obviously Cuba did what it wanted, even under the Soviet hegemony. It got involved in Africa and places like that, where clearly the United States was against that. But my sense is that there was always some communication going on.
Cristina, when we talk about change, between Cuba and the United States, this evolving relationship that we see right now, it's only been very recent, 13 months ago, that, we started seeing or hearing talk about this change publicly. In Cuba itself, what has changed? I mean, has any of this change filtered down to the average Cuban there?
Well, I would love to give you a better answer than the one that I'm giving you. I'm very satisfied because of the accomplishments that Obama has made around reestablishing diplomatic relations with Cuba and giving the U.S. citizens rights, like, for example, coming to Cuba and being able to see by themselves what's going on in this country and not just be led by very strong and hostile rhetoric from Cuban Americans, congresswomen and men. But the thing is that for Cubans, that reestablishing of diplomatic relations hasn't meant much, because the main policy that asphyxiates the Cuban economy, the main policy that does not allow Cuba to perform normally in the international commerce and in the international economy is still in place. Even though Obama has tried to make some changes, he's not able to do it because it takes a congressional act. So that means that for Cubans, besides seeing more Americans on our streets and besides seeing a lot of visitors from the U.S., actually in terms of how our economy and how we can work actually is pretty much the same, because we cannot use the U.S. dollars, we cannot, banks run away from us because they're afraid of getting fined from the Treasury Department because of doing transactions for Cuba. So in general, still the main issues of the blockade or the embargo, as you call it, is still in place. So that means our life hasn't changed. And there's a tendency from the U.S. government to talk about getting closer to the private sector in Cuba, which is okay. But the private sector is quite small in Cuba, and the main services that we Cubans receive are provided by the government. So definitely governments needs to talk between each other, needs to be able to make business between each other, and for that that the embargo or the blockade needs to be lifted immediately. So until then, our life is not going to change.
Okay, we have to take a break.